All right, I'm back, and I'm here with Lindsay Murphy. Lindsay and I go back to a former Fortune 15 client that we were both working with, is separate entities. She was formerly the head of data at Sakota, and we were standing up Sakota's software solution at this same client, and it was a great partnership. Lindsay, I just heard your talk in cost containment. It was so good.
Thank you.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. So, tell me more. What brought you to the Data Connect conference first?
Yeah. So I've been getting more into public speaking and conference talks. So I was kind of looking for conferences to apply to, and this one stood out because it's an all-female speaker list, which is all-female and gender-fluid speaker list, which is very unique. And yeah, it's been amazing so far.
Oh my gosh, yeah. I got the opportunity to come last year. Because a good colleague of mine was a keynote panelist, but I'm really interested in the talk that you gave. And I want to, also give an opportunity to shout out the podcast that you're working on, centering women leaders in data. What's the name of that podcast?
It's called Women Lead Data. It's available everywhere podcasts are available.
When did you start it? How many episodes are you up to?
I started it in December, and I think, you're quizzing me now. I think we just did episode 23 like a couple weeks ago.
Oh my gosh,
yeah.
It's so exciting.
Yeah.
This podcast just launched.
Congrats.
I don't know, like a couple weeks ago. We've got 6 episodes at the time of recording this. The 7th just launched today. And so I'm really excited to be doing this very early our start to talk through this conference. But you just gave a really compelling talk about cost containment. For those who obviously aren't here, I'm just wondering if you could summarize real quick in a couple minutes so each of the questions.
Yeah.
Your talk.
So I think that the title is Cost Containment, the critical piece of your data team's ROI. And I guess the kind of governing idea of the whole talk is really that data teams spend quite a bit of time thinking about our value and what we deliver as value as part of our ROI, but a lot of times we kind of forget about the cost piece. And I think that is catching some data teams in a bad situation with the economy changing in the way that it has over the past few years. And I think that a lot of data teams have built up these really big stacks, and then all of a sudden these big shifts are happening and our costs are kind of going through the roof, and just scaling a data team is very expensive and very difficult. So I kind of was trying to get the audience to kind of think a little bit more about how can you be cost conscious up front? How do you build data assets to help you measure cost? And then how do you kind of just make sure that you don't get caught in the situation where, your company sees you as this very, very expensive team that you can't tell them what value you deliver. And so then you end up getting laid off, essentially.
Yeah. And I think you talked wisely about mirroring sort of these small micro cost structures and the economic impacts within a business to this wider period that we had, a zero interest rate period. You talk a lot about that and how we've moved post to that period.
Yeah.
The cost of doing business is just more expensive because the cost of money is more expensive.
Yeah.
I'm curious if through your experience and through, looking at this and the work that you're partnering with companies and building up these dashboards to try to determine cost up front, if you've got any really practical tips that you can share that can help folks. I got some that I took away from, but I'm curious about your perspectives if there's big ones.
Yeah, I think the biggest one that I've learned is kind of thinking about the total cost of ownership. So I think especially with a lot of the tools in the modern data stack, there's kind of this false sense of, oh, this is really cheap. Data warehouses especially, you can start dumping data in there and running queries, and out of the gate, it's probably going to be very cheap until you start getting bigger data sets and running more complex queries. So I think it's this kind of false sense of safety that, we're really not spending that much, and very quickly that can change. So I think for data teams to actually sit down, and when you're choosing vendors, when you're thinking about which tools to implement, actually doing kind of a cost, total cost of ownership analysis up front. And that's really thinking about, okay, this might be what it's costing me today, but what is it going to cost, 6-12 months down the road? And even for, small companies that don't have a data team yet, I think there's sometimes decisions that are made before the data team even comes in that can be very detrimental to the data team later. I know I've joined companies where they'll start with something like Segment, which ends up being very expensive in the long run. But when you start out, they have a pricing plan that's $150 a month, and then you very quickly outgrow that plan, and then your next jump up is very significant. So I think it's just don't be I think the biggest takeaway would be don't fall for the pricing models that sometimes seem very low when you start out, because you'll often very quickly outgrow that.
Yeah. As someone who is entering the space, and I think I'm probably data fluent to a certain degree, certainly not literate. in many capacities. I resonated. You told the story about a data scientist running a SQL query, or maybe not a data scientist, but someone who had access to data and charging $5,000 per year.
Yeah.
I have been in that experience at a private employer where I got my spool space limited on a data warehouse because my query was written so bad. And I was just thinking through like, oh yeah, in the cloud, there's no one really going in so many of organizations monitoring those costs. I think the other thing that you really shared that I found really insightful is how to monitor costs post implementation of a new update or change, and being able to say like, is my new feature push, is my new query that I updated performant, or is it driving up cost? And the table that you're like, oh, I could look at each feature request. Talk more about that.
Yeah. So I think sometimes it's, there's kind of this trend of like, you don't really look at cost until it becomes a problem. And I think that is where then it's such a big problem that it's almost like it's gotten away from you. And now you're going to have a really big project, some kind of thing to figure it out. So what I was kind of recommending is like put the time in up front to really build these assets and be able to see, what's going to come ahead of time. And then part of that would be to even break it down into like a code review level, or piece of work almost in a sense, so that if somebody, is putting up a new PR for a change in your DBT project or something, is there a way that you can actually see, what did the model cost us to run before and what's it going to cost after this change? So it's almost more like a cost diffing instead of just code diffing. I think if we can get to that unit of work, then that becomes part of the person's role of managing costs down to that small unit of work, rather than, waiting for everything to kind of get worse and perform worse over time. And then it becomes this big mess that you have to fix.
Yeah, I think a lot of companies in the growth stage, they don't even think about this because they're so focused on acquisition and revenue driving. They're not monitoring their costs as much. And I think in this post-zero rate world, you're starting to see more boards and executive leadership really hone in on like their cost structure, because it just costs so much to get money now.
Yeah.
I'm curious, you also cited one more specific example where there was an auto suspend feature in one of your data asset tools that just kept your data warehouse open for 5 minutes, and just reducing that down to 1 minute saved, I think you said 64%.
Yeah.
Tell more about like just that, and like, do you see there other sort of, I've got two questions. One I think is probably more nefarious, but the first one I will just ask is like, do you see other examples where people could just really quickly make small tune changes that really drastically reduce their costs?
Yeah, so I'll give a shout out to the team at select.dev, and they create a cost reduction tool for Snowflake. And so that's where I've learned a lot of the things that I've learned about for Snowflake specifically. And they have tons of great blog posts. So shout out to Ian and Niall over there. If you check out their website, they've got tons of resources. But that one that you mentioned was the auto suspend feature. And so by default, the company Snowflake has set this to 5 minutes. And maybe that's based on data, maybe it's not. But for most people, you don't need your warehouse to continue running for 5 minutes unless you're like hitting it with queries all the time. But for most analytics or internal BI use cases, it's fine to reduce that. And essentially what that does is it just means that the warehouse isn't constantly running all the time. It doesn't stay on for another 5 minutes. After a query is done, it just shuts off within a minute. So little things like that, I think it's, you try to figure out like, what are the default settings, and is this set up in the way that's appropriate for my company? And oftentimes they might not be. There's definitely some other things that they recommend that I've also tried as well, is just like the individual query optimization. So if you find specific queries, go in and actually figure out, how do I avoid a full table scan on this? Is there a way for me to partition the table differently, or query different parts of the table so that will perform better? And I've seen quite a bit of improvement in some of the things I was working on from that as well.
Awesome. And now to my nefarious question. Do you think settings like that are defaulted, do you think they might just be realizing that that's something people won't catch and drive up profit? Or do you think it's just absent-minded? They don't really think about it?
I'm sure there's business decisions built into that. Yeah, I would say like they probably just decided that 5 minutes is what they want to set it at. But I think they probably know that that's not the best default use case for most people. So I think that's just where, again, like having that understanding and educating yourself about how the tool that you're using spends money, and then how you can kind of make those changes, is always super important to take that responsibility yourself. Other tools, I mentioned Fivetran, like some of those tools, like they just don't have safeguards built in. And so customers ask for the feature of like, can you build something that, well, if we spend over a certain budget, it just turns the tool off. And it's like, why would they build that feature? Like they want you to spend money.
Well, but also you don't want to disrupt your data operations.
Exactly. Yeah.
So you kind of need that fine tune. It's really understanding what problem needs to truly be solved for those customers. I had another question, and now it's fading for me. This concept around, like, we have these concepts in product and engineering of technical debt.
Yeah.
But I think we don't talk enough about the other types of debt that organizations accrue outside of that, like organizational and operational debt. We have documentation debt all over the place, especially in the world of data and cataloging it. And then you have data governance debt. Do you find that these are sort of decisions that are also sort of related to that? It's somewhat technical debt, but it's also like data literacy debt, data fluency debt, and how do we tackle those problems?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think those things are, again, they need to be kind of like negotiated in the upfront so that they don't necessarily become the debt, because then they have to become this big project that then you have to resource and kind of dig your way back out of the hole. I think the best cases that I've seen is when you either plan up front to try, like, what are the ways that we're going to avoid this on an ongoing basis so that it becomes kind of more like a hygiene thing, a continual hygiene thing, rather than waiting for it to get so bad that you have to plan a big upfront project, or a big like ad hoc project. So I feel like building those types of things and those expectations that you're going to have a percentage of your workload is always going to some amount of maintenance. The way that I've kind of managed some of my teams is like in quarterly planning, I would kind of think of like, here's all the team that I have, here's how many hours they have in the quarter, here's my full bucket of resources. And then I would kind of like use a pie chart to like break it out into like, okay, I only want to spend like 20 or 30% of my time on maintenance.
Yeah.
And so people would plan to pick up like technical debt bugs every kind of sprint, and maybe documentation might have been part of that. So I think kind of chipping away at it a little bit is kind of the way to go. And then I've also seen, software engineering sprints, they'll just kind of do like a bug bash thing, and that can help you dig your way out. But hopefully you don't have to get to that point.
Yeah, hopefully so. It's something that I am always cognizant of reminding my clients, like, you can accrue some amount of debt. Right. That's fine.
Yeah.
But you have to know when you're going to pay it back.
Yeah, exactly.
And if you don't, it's just going to keep piling up, and sooner or later your house of cards is going to collapse.
Right, yeah. Yeah, technical debt almost becomes kind of like a strategic thing that you want to manage it properly, because if you don't allow any, then you're spending too much time on it.
Yeah.
But you don't want to let it get out of control.
Yeah. I think these trade-offs eventually, I'm starting to toy with this thought in my mind for an essay that I'm working on around the concept of all of these debts combining into ethical debt. And these small trade-offs we make because we want to reach market faster, get profitability, we want to drive quickly. What small ethical decisions do we make? And how do those start creating a culture where more ethical or unethical decisions can be made? And so how do we help our organizations go through that? I haven't fully formed this theory, but I'm just starting to talk about it more now. So look forward to that from me. But I know we have a lot for this conference to get back to. I want to thank you so much for, humoring me and spending some time chatting. I can't wait to see what you're up to next and all of the work that you're doing with the organizations you're partnering with today. I'm so excited we finally got to meet.
Yeah, I know. It's so awesome.
Yeah. Well, have a wonderful rest of the conference, and I'll see you around.
You too. Thanks.